Hello, everybody. Scott Stevens here, and no sooner do we get Sally ashore and begin to watch her roll in after dumping copious amounts of rain. Some locations, some of the weather underground, the weather stations like I would have or you would have, are just reading incredible totals, and undoubtedly they're a mistake, or are they? Probably they're a mistake when you see totals 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 inches. That's just ridiculous because these homemade, well, they're not homemade, but the consumer grade weather stations just can only take so much of a beating before they kind of begin to reveal erroneous readings. But nonetheless, she's on the move, beginning to move into far southern Alabama or deeper into Alabama, and then we'll cross into Georgia easily before midnight tonight, and then begin to accelerate off towards the northeast thereafter. But nonetheless, she's ashore. So let's pop here. Let's start with the radar in here, and we can still see many counties undergoing or enduring flash flood watches, and this after a day and a half of moderate to heavy rain, sometimes torrential rain. You get a little bit of a break. You think it's okay, but the wind is still blowing, and you're still, within the pressure gradient of the center of the storm, which we see right in through here. The whole backside, the whole southwestern side is now wide open, and the rain now beginning to advance into Georgia, as we can see. So let's start with Ben Knoll over on Twitter, keeping a very close watch on the impacts to New England and Atlantic Canada next week. This would be from Teddy, QRST. So we'll move from Sally to Teddy. And now the models still have it way south here, but with such a strong ridge in place across the central and eastern part of the U.S., it really is prevented from moving into that mountain of high pressure. It just cannot find a way through. So it has to go through the path of least resistance, and depending on the periphery of this high, will in many ways determine the path, as it does with all tropical storms, of Teddy. But the European models, which tend to be somewhat more accurate than the American models, they're just newer. It's newer physics. They've got a little hot weather computing system over there that they're working on. The U.S., we've just finally funded some upgrades to ours, so hopefully we'll be able to see that come to fruition within the next 2-3 years. Now, this morning marks only the second time since 1950 that the Atlantic Basin has had 3 hurricanes of at least Category 2 active at the same time. There's Teddy here, there's Sally, and then I believe it's Paulette is on up to the north as a Category 2, barely. And then 3 other areas that we're watching, and that would be, and then also Vicky, but Vicky probably not going to do much as she's largely exposed at this particular point. Let's come here then, let's go back up. Hurricane Sally continues to bring life-threatening wind, rain, and flooding. This video from a firefighter's Pensacola home this 5 hours ago. Disaster relief teams do stand by and are ready to help first responders. And, of course, prayers to all of those impacted, and that number grows as Sally continues to press inland. But it's a lot of trees. That is a climate that is just so good for trees and for vegetation to grow. But it's kind of unnerving when those wood trees have to endure those kind of winds for that kind of long. Video from Ono Island shows significant damage with the most of these piers and so forth really in kind of a rough shape. They're not meant to deal with these kind of winds. And, it's 2x4s it's just kind of rough. Algeria, deadly floods hitting the northern provinces, as the theme of flooding and 2020 seem to go hand in hand. And if it's not rain, if it's not water, then it is fire and it is air. So that's where we are. David Birch, cycle 24, minimum sunspot count of 1.8 is the lowest since 1823, which had 1.6 as in solar cycle 5. In my humble opinion, sophisticated technology has registered sunspots prior to 1850, but would not have been spotted, thus skewing the sunspot data considerably, meaning that there may have been more sunspots in those early 1800s than were counted and therefore logged. So because of the technology that we have today, and this count of 1.8 being just barely above the 1.6 counted then, if there was an inherent underbias to the counting 200 years ago, then it's possible that this minimum sunspot count of solar cycle 24 of 1.8 is below that, and maybe even significantly below that of 1823. And if you remember, we were previously coming out of a solar minimum in the early 1800s. And if you look at the climate change issues, most of those show the warming happening from 1880 and forward. That's kind of a lot to digest, but nonetheless, we're essentially saying that a lot of what has happened, sunspots, we may be in such a deep hole that we're glad we've had this warm spell, that it'll take a couple of years for it to kind of wane, and then the full effects of a solar minimum will now be felt. All right, this is unfortunate. This is in Africa, and with their flood next to drought conditions, and this was a sugarcane farm. And part of what we've kind of been concerned about here, and continue to be so, is the loss of supply, the loss of whether it's sugars, whether it's grains, whether it's rices, whether it's fishing. The risk to the food supply is complex, and it is right now the threats are very, very real, and they just keep hammering at it a little bit by little bit by little bit, and eventually a chunk falls off, and then that takes some time to refill, if it's even possible. So we're watching these little chinks in the armor show up day after day. 4 new fires reported, so says the National Energy Agency Fire Center up in Boise, bringing the national total to 79 large events underway. Firefighters continue to meet their suppression goals and contained 9 large fires yesterday. Congratulations, guys. Weather conditions remain a factor, including possible critical fire weather across northeastern California, and that largely because of wind. That is the issue. So new 4 large fires, a number of fires contain 9, as we just mentioned, with essentially 4 million acres under attack or having been burned by these large fires. And we're almost to 7 million acres burned this year. And if we look back over the last decade, we see that 2017 with 8.4 million, and then 2012 also with essentially 8.4 million acres being the apex of the number of fires that have been underway. All right, so the record heat out west has kind of set the stage for that kind of those raging infernos. And longer term, I just don't see a whole lot of relief, at least through this week. Oregon and Washington in particular, and British Columbia even more so, likely to see a little bit of rain. But as far as record heat come tomorrow, mostly what is that? Elko, Nevada at 93, Phoenix at 109, Needles at 110. So kind of warm up there. American Falls, Idaho at 89 degrees. The record, well, I guess it goes back to 1892. That's a pretty substantial record, 89 right there for American Falls, right next to and just west of Pocatello. The other story, whether this is smoke, whether this was from the early cold that impacted the western states last week, is hundreds of thousands of migratory birds dead in one of the Southwest's largest bird die-offs on record. And they're still trying to understand why such a broad spectrum of bird species, from swallows to finches to warblers, have passed away during this particular migration. And this week now, across the eastern U.S., hundreds of millions of birds are afoot. I think it was 2 nights ago, one of the migratory websites had 50 million birds will be in flight tonight alone. I think that was back 2 nights ago on the 14th. So this is the time when we're migrating, and when we are dealing with I'm just giving it all away. All these fires, all these previous safe havens to where you could set down, roost for the night, maybe get a little food, a little something to eat. It, in some ways, only makes sense of the issues that we're going to have with migrating wildlife. They've got to have a stable economy. Yes, an economy, a natural economy, to where there's food and water and shelter at their particular spots. All right, 112, 17 miles east of Browley, California, for the nation's hotspot yesterday. 22, 4 miles northwest of Grand Lake, Colorado. And this is the Atlantic. The Atlantic is just lit up like a fireworks. So there's Vicky, Teddy, Sally. Paulette has now been dissipated, although they're still kind of watching it to see if it reforms. The risk is kind of low. But it is Teddy, probably going to be the feature that is most interesting, as we've got great circulation. It's strong. There's Sally coming ashore, and then this disturbed area, but it's Teddy that is in better placed to impact at least the northeastern coast. Let's watch these clouds racing down through here. This is intense. This whole spiral. And what I find most fascinating is how these upper clouds look like they're barely moving at all. They're just kind of drifting with the beast, where down below the winds are ferocious. And part of me just says some of this just doesn't look right. There looks like there's an electrical aspect of this that isn't being accounted for. That there's some part of these big vortexes, these implosions in the etheric field cannot be fully explained, and maybe that's why the forecasting them is kind of a bit of a challenge by regular thermodynamics. There's got to be some other force at play. All right, there's the smoke all through California. We'll look at that again, but you can see it then arcing across this ridge that's in place out west, kind of diving down to Kansas, but more than likely, or it just continues to be drawn very quickly into the jet stream, then way out over the Atlantic. This smoke plume, like Australia's last year, we'll be able to trace it via satellite, via the aerosols, completely around the planet in time. That's just kind of a given because the quantity of smoke that continues to come out of these many fires, these, just shy of 90 fires that are active right now. Some are going with the snows in Colorado, but I'm seeing another hot plume showing a bit of infrared right through there. I also see a couple of chemtrails right in through here, and then a whole slew of them up here through northern Idaho, through northwestern Montana. And it's on the edge where clouds are just barely visible to where, I don't know if you guys are hearing that or not, where the boundary of the high pressure ridge and the jet stream, that's where these trails really like to show up. And then you can see how the two different weather systems begin to interact, and the activity shown by these contrails really is huge for those weather engineers to get a grip on what's happening around the area. All right, here's some of these totals in western Pennsylvania. Pensacola right here, 0. We know that didn't happen. More than likely, the site just simply went down. Pensacola, 0.02. We know that didn't happen. The site was down. And I need to refresh this because I've had enough other tabs open that I've got to just tell it I'm right here. We'll flush this, and Pensacola will paint some others. 11 inches, that seems reasonable, as does the 9, and the 9, the 3. The 97, not so much over at Orange Beach. Gulf Breezes probably lost some rainfall just because it went over the gauge and didn't get into the gauge. 12 inches, 15 inches, 7 inches, 8 inches, 5, 6, 6, 6, 2, 12, 11, 17, 91. That looks like an error. So we've got some pretty impressive totals, and you can easily see why we had the flooding that we had. And when you've got those winds driving all of this water, Fort Walton Beach and so forth, all up against the shore, it really compounds the issue. And because Sally stalled for nearly a day, God bless you guys, having to endure that relentless rainfall. And as we move inland, 9 inches, 6 inches, nearly 6 inches, 4.5, 4 inches, and more so as we head up into Georgia. So the big threat, or the big range tonight, will be from Columbus, probably all the way up towards Greenville, South Carolina. And it'll be up here when combined with the terrain that we will see. The creeks running high, the streams are at bank full, and the risk of some additional isolated flooding. All right, temperatures hot, East Texas, Louisiana, low 90s, but it's just humid. It's just straight up humid. The Southwest, much drier. The monsoon isn't what it was, so their humidity values are down, and that lets the 100 not feel like 125, but more like maybe 110. And then into Central California, because of the obscuring effects of so much smoke, that has kept temperatures down. I got to be honest with you. When we talk about volcanoes blowing and adding all this sulfuric acid and the sulfur dioxides into the atmosphere, that whole veil that comes around the planet, you just turn the sun back by 1-2%. It has a profound effect when accumulating over weeks to months and even a year or two. And this will have a similar effect despite the pulse of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. And when we talk about ashes to ashes, now we're at ashes. And those ashes are at worst fuel for new growth. Those nutrients released into the atmosphere, be drawn up by plants or rained out onto the soils and then utilized once again. It's the cycle of life, and that is the beauty and the alchemy of fire. Everything will go through that part of the cycle given enough time. The heat or the humidity, dew points at or above 60 degrees, denoted by maybe at 65 degrees, denoted by the green the green dashed line. And then we've got Sally in here lifting towards the north and east, and some moisture now beginning to slowly encroach upon the northwest, but a lot of hazy weathers, a lot of just miserable outdoor conditions to allow for breathing. All right, this is the forecast. And what has been the controlling factor for Sally has been this strong ridge to the west and then a little bit of a ridge, much, much weaker, but it really hasn't given Sally an opening, a place to scoot on through, to dive out. That just hasn't existed. And so as I kind of roll this forward through today, tomorrow, we've got a low coming ashore. And then here's good old, so many names. Teddy. Why? I'll never remember Teddy. Well, I can't say never, but there's good old Teddy out there. And you can see how this next trough, this guy right here, comes on through and then eventually wants to impact it and sweep it off to the north and east. But what the trend that I'm catching out of this as we move through the next 15 days is how these lows come over the top of the ridge and then kind of plunge into the eastern United States. And that ultimately, we'll see if this plays out. If we develop a large, deep low over Hudson Bay area, that is almost a winter-type scenario and would really allow for a lot of chilly air to drop into the eastern U.S. You can see the snow, that 540 line, this thickness line, this blue dashed line is kind of largely the delineation between rain and snow, or at least slush at the very worst. And certainly the higher elevation you get through Pennsylvania, New York, Ontario, Quebec, and even into Michigan, some of these higher terrain locations will absolutely see some snow as we begin the month of October. Out west, though, I want to take this to additional precip products. I want to look at total precip accumulation, scroll this forward through the same 15 days, and there's good old Sally right through here. That's her track. A lot of sunshine as we move into October. So October is typically the sunniest month for the United States at these latitudes. And I don't see a whole lot of relief into the Cascades, an inch and a half. Not a lot, but it's enough if you're firefighting to get some relief. Some good precip in the Colorado mountains, inch and a half, 2 inches as we get into the lower Sangre to Crystal Range, but not much for California for the firefighters there. And that takes us through 6Z, that's midnight as we initiate the 2nd of October. And that's unfortunate because we would like to see a little relief for those guys. Good to see you guys over there. You're coming in on, I guess you're there on my page, all of you. None on Weather Wars, on Twitter and so forth. So good to see you. Throw me a hashtag and just the city you're in so I know where to call out, who to shout out to on these kind of little broadcasts. All right, what do we want to look at? One last item. Maybe, I've got a whole lot more over here. This is differential precip as compared to normal. So the reds, we get to about 2 inches shy of what would normally fall. The greens and blues, the blues 2 inches plus. Obviously with Sally here, we're going to have some nice juicy totals. In fact, almost excessive totals. And then the northwest and some of the northern high plains getting some moisture through the next 2 weeks. That's the good news. But California, just not a lot in store for you. And my heart goes out to you. It's been one heck of a season. There'll be some relief, but it isn't in the immediate future. So what is going on? The fires are going to stay active. If we can cool off and soak up Oregon, maybe we can pull some crews that are off those and then redeploy them down into California. But just had a gal stop by the house a couple hours ago who was on the Cameron Peak fire in northern Colorado, and she's like, it's apocalyptic. Not all, but the vast majority of the resources we have for wildland firefighters are already deployed. They're out there on the scene at this point in time. So give them your best and your thoughts and prayers, and they can keep the situation under control and minimize the loss that we have to life and property. All right, guys, I'll catch you on another perspective coming up on, let's see. What we're going to talk about is come on, Scott, the biggest secret. What two things could change everything on this planet? What two things? We'll go through a list and say yes or no. And then I'll give you what I think are the two things that will change everything on this planet. All right, that's on another perspective. My other twice-a-week show on Monday, Wednesday at 6 o'clock Mountain. So that's coming up in 40 minutes. If you want to hang around, I'll catch you then. And we'll have a cool discussion about things that I think are coming in very, very short order. All right, catch you then. Have a great evening, everybody. And in the meantime, keep looking up.